Welcome to this Chapter 8 of Indian Economic Development. We are talking about human capital formation in this chapter, especially with regards to India. And the introduction in this section begins with a very brief concept on why it is that doctors, engineers, and lawyers earn more than janitors. Well, this is something we've already touched on in class. And although the explanation here is very, very straightforward, I think it's too simplistic, right? There are a number of factors here the textbook doesn't consider, but the basic concept here is that those who have skill are valued by society and as a result are able to earn a larger amount of money because they contribute more to society. But you remember from our discussions in class, a soccer player, a professional soccer player, offers very little in terms of contribution to society. He doesn't save people's lives. He doesn't allow them to fight injustice, but what he does do is generate significant income for him or herself and maybe for their soccer club. So the idea of skill being simply a function of education is somewhat misleading. Skill comes in many forms, but this chapter is primarily going to focus on skill as it's related to education. So the first section of this book talks about what is human capital formation and how do we count it? And it goes through a very simple numerical example, but I'm going to go through one even more relatable. Let's say in our country, in year 1, we have 100 lawyers, doctors, engineers, and professors in total. And in year 2, we've now got 150 lawyers, doctors, engineers, and professionals. So what does that mean? Well, that means we've increased the number of skilled people we've had in our society now by 50 in a single year. So that means our human capital formation in this country in this year was 50. Now, what are the ways we can increase our human capital formation? Well, the country itself, or the people themselves, can spend more money on education, which is called an expenditure on education. They can spend money on healthcare. They can do on-the-job training, study programs for adults, migration, which is something they're talking about domestically in this book, and expenditure on information. So let's talk about education. Now, I know we're talking about this in context of India, but I'm going to give you a localized example here for Japan, some food for thought for all of you in this class. So when we spend money on education, we're able to earn a higher income over our entire lives. And I've taken Japanese data and statistics to prove this to you on this next slide here. So if we go to the next slide, you can see here very simply that somebody who does not get an education beyond the 10th grade, their salary in Japan is represented by this green line. And so in year 1, they'll earn just under 2 million yen. And by the time they retire, they'll be able to earn just around 5 million yen. However, for those who are educated, they've got to go to school for 7 more years, right? You need 2 years of high school, so grade 11 and grade 12. Then you take a 4-year university program. And then I've given you a slack year for either taking a year off between high school and university or entering the job market 1 year later after relaxing or traveling around the world or doing something. So let's say you don't work for 7 years. Well, when you do enter the job market, suddenly your salary is far greater than that of those who are uneducated. But the uneducated people will in fact have a greater sum or gross earnings over their lifetime for probably about 15 or 16 years. But after that point, the two lines or the sum of the incomes diverge from each other, and educated people tend to have a far greater lifetime income. And that is actually represented in some sense here. As you look at the end of the graph, you'll notice the gap between uneducated and educated in terms of income earnings per annum is starting to diverge very significantly. Next, let's talk about the expenditure on health. Well, if you're sick or people in your country are sick, they can't work. They can't work. They can't earn money. If they can't earn money, then the GDP for the country is obviously not improving. It's very, very straightforward. Next, on-the-job training. This is something that firms provide for individuals, and they want to ensure that their employees are able to perform some skills. And this is a win-win situation because the firm is now able to take advantage of the fact that the employee can do something that they could not previously do, and the employee themselves are now able to do something that they were not able to do before, and that's something they can add to their resume. Next, let's talk about study programs for adults. There are NGOs or government organizations that offer programs for individuals to be able to improve their skills outside of school. This is usually for people in their mid 20s, maybe even 30s or 40s, and they want to learn something. So the government provides a program for them. They usually can study at a very low price or maybe free, usually in the evenings, and then they're able to build a skill. When I lived in Canada, there were classes in IT available to all people in society at the local high schools at night for free. In Japan, they provide education classes for all the immigrants that are here because they hope one day that those immigrants will be able to use the Japanese that they've learned to become productive in society and help grow the country's GDP. Next, let's talk about migration in the context of India. It means moving from a rural area to an urban area. And very simply said, there are costs involved. You have to pay to move. But you do that because you know that the return on income or your work is going to be far greater. So the income earning potential in an urban area is far greater than that in a rural area. And because of that, people are willing to invest in spending money to move across the country. In Japan and in other parts of the world, this also happens, but I think it's more important to think about this not only from an internal perspective, but from an external perspective. We would like our most skilled people from around the world to come to our country and help us grow or improve our economic condition, right? So we'd like to actually have migration from the highest, most skilled people around the world coming to our country. And lastly here, it talks about the expenditure on information. Well, this subject here is kind of vague and unclear. The details are ambiguous, but it mentions basically that people are willing to pay for information. They want to find out which is the best company to work for or which is the best school to go to. So they're willing to spend money to research and find that out. The reason why I'm pretty confused about this is there's this thing called the internet, and we can find out this information pretty much for free all over the world. So I'm not sure why the textbook thinks that people are actually spending significant amounts of money on having access to information. The next section here, and the last section of this video, which is section 3, is very, very, very straightforward. So human capital formation and economic growth. What's the connection? How are they related? Well, there are 4 different areas where we can clearly see human capital formation leads to economic growth. The first being a change in emotional and material environment of growth. Secondly, higher productivity or physical capital. Third, innovative skills. And lastly, higher participation rate and equality. So let's talk about each of these. The first one, emotional environments and material environments of growth change. What does that mean? Well, the emotional environment means people tend to become growth oriented as a result of having increased levels of capital formation. So the emotional environment or the desire actually to contribute increases. And the material environment means, well, now that all the people in society have higher levels of skill, they want to work in a way to be kind of productive. And as a result of that, all of society benefits. So the material environment implies that society now possesses a higher number of skilled workers, and the emotional environment means each individual worker feels motivated or the desire to want to work. Next, higher productivity of physical capital is really straightforward. It mentions in the textbook that people who are skilled are better able to use machinery to generate more efficient output, maybe. But more importantly, if you are skilled, you are going to be able to generate more levels of output in general, whether you use machinery or not. Next, innovative skills, again, very, very straightforward. If you are educated, you tend to find solutions to problems, which is the whole point of education. And as a result, you could bring innovative change to your country, and this is something India needs desperately. And lastly here, the higher rate of participation and equality. You've studied for 7 or 8 or 9 or 10 or 11 years in school. After all that studying, what are you going to do? Sit home and not work? No, of course, you're going to enter the job force. And when you do, you're going to contribute to GDP. That's a very straightforward situation that goes on with most people. Most people go to school to want to actually work. They don't go to school just to be able to sit home. So what do we see here? Do we see a link between human capital formation and economic growth? Well, of course, obviously. It's very, very straightforward. So as education levels increase, as on-the-job training increases, as we spend more money on healthcare, All of these factors combine to be able to allow us to improve our economy because our people want to work and they're able to work. And that's the most important takeaway from this section.